and I should say Black History Month in 1976. So let me
Oh,
share my
hold on
screen.
just a second.
All right.
Warren,
Let me know when.
you've got it.
All right. Now it's telling me I'm still disabled. Oh, now it tells me I'm host. Let's try it again. There we go. All right.
And there you go.
Excellent. So again, a little background on ASALH, and the branch here in Bradenton and Sarasota happens to be the largest of the many branches around the country, and we are always open for new members. So please join us. I'll give you some more information on our website, some of the information at the end of our talk. Uh, and let me also mention at the outset,
I didn't see
if I were doing this class live at Ollie or at um, the Unity Church, we'd be sharing passages and I'd be making assignments. I can't do that, but there are some passages that I do want to share, and I hate to do that over this venue because it is difficult. But I think they speak better than I can, obviously, to the subject that I want to address. So, the hard history Americans refuse to embrace. Uh, the Teaching Hard History is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I hope you all know that important organization, the work that they've done in racial and social justice for certainly all of my life. Uh, the Teaching Tolerance program is about 25 years old. And when I started teaching uh, American slavery, I discovered this phenomenal resource. And so I'm going to be sharing some of the American slavery material from Teaching Tolerance. I think Natalie in the intro mentioned the 1619 Project from the New York Times. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that, both because it is still so fresh. Last year being the 400-year commemoration of the first Africans sold in the colonies that would become the United States. Not the first Africans in the New World or in the Western Hemisphere. The monuments controversy I'm going to touch on as it relates to how we do history, how we do memory in history, and help us understand why all the controversy and how distorted our history becomes when we refuse to see the truth, indeed, when we hide the truth. And then I'll conclude by talking about this Sarasota School Board controversy. Those of you from Sarasota would remember several months ago an effort to do some uh, racial sensitivity training that created quite a controversy that I think also touches on this really the refusal for our institutions, educational institutions, to really come to grips with our history of Africans and American slavery in the New World. So let me touch on this project, Teaching Hard History. As I said, it's been around for some time. The beauty of the project is that they took a very scientific approach to understanding what our high schools, middle schools are teaching and what they're failing to teach with regard to American slavery. And so they looked at obviously both the students, the teachers, the textbooks, and state standards. And they covered most of the 50 states. and it's quite an interesting outcome. They developed 8 key concepts, 10 key concepts, which drive their work. And I'll just share these with you so you have a grasp of the scope of this thing. So the first concept, slavery, which Europeans practiced before they invaded the Americas, was important in all colonial powers and existed in all North American colonies. These concepts, again, are the author's belief about what you ought to know as you leave primary and secondary education, before you go to college, before you graduate. The second concept, slavery and the slave trade, were central to the development and growth of the colonial economies and what is now the US. There is this misunderstanding, this myth that slavery is a Southern thing. They do a very good job of explaining how slavery spread across all 13 colonies, and after the colonial period, all of what would become the United States. Third key concept, protections for slavery were embedded in the founding documents. Enslavers dominated the federal government, Supreme Court, and Senate from 1787 through 1860. We spent a lot of time on this area in my class, because it's important to understand when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, when we talk about the constitutions, we need to understand that there were explicit protections built in to those documents that obviously supported the institution of slavery. The fourth concept, slavery as an institution of power, was an institution of power designed to create profit for the enslavers and break the will of the enslaved, and was a relentless quest for profit abetted by racism. Some of the best scholarship over the last 10 years has really touched on the issue of really the economics of slavery, and how critical slavery was to the early growth of America as a world power. And indeed, the historians who work in this area would say America could not be what it is today but for the enslaved labor and the benefits it brought. Fifth key concept, enslaved people resisted the efforts of their enslavers to reduce them to commodities in both revolutionary and everyday ways. The teaching tolerance material is excellent in many respects. It's certainly excellent in demonstrating all of the many ways that enslaved men, women, and children revolted, both in violent ways and in more subtle ways. And it was truth from forced boarding of those ships in the Middle Passage, and it would remain true through today, I would argue. The sixth key concept, the experience of slavery varied depending upon time, location, crop labor performed, size of slaveholding, and gender. We have this thought of slavery as cotton is king, and that's very true. But we need to understand that slavery touched every part of the American economy, the pre-colonial, the colonial, the pre-Civil War, post-Civil War economy, in every aspect, in the cities, on the farms, at shipyards and rail yards. It was, again, the backbone of the American economy. Seventh concept, slavery was the central cause of the Civil War. I know it strikes some of us that there's still people who argue this point, but what the materials do is go to the statements of the secessionists, go to the documents that were filed as the 11 seceding states left and wrote their own constitution. They were explicit as to why they were leaving. It was to preserve their rights in their mind to maintain men, women, and children in bondage. The eighth concept, slavery shaped the fundamental beliefs of Americans about race and whiteness, and white supremacy was both a product and legacy of slavery. This is really, as it says, fundamental to understanding both how slavery was justified. How could a so-called Christian nation enslave these millions of people, and how could they continue post-slavery to subjugate those same people for hundreds of years. The ninth principle, enslaved and freed people worked to maintain cultural traditions while building new ones that sustain communities and impact the larger world. We know that today because we see the evidence of the impact of African-American life and culture on every part of the world we know. We need to understand that that was true there back then as well, in every respect. Both within their own communities that were built out of necessity in order to survive, but also to ensure the future and the legacy. I'm going to pause. I see some people I need to let in here since I'm the admit all. All right. And then the last, by knowing how to read and interpret these sources that tell the story of American slavery, we gain insight into some of what enslaving and enslaved Americans aspired to, create, and desired. So these 10 principles, again, drive this material, this Teaching Hard History curriculum. Ira Berlin, if you've read Berlin's, he's perhaps my favorite historian of the 17th, 18th century, particularly as it regards slavery. And so he was a consultant to this project and has again written some very, very important works. Okay. There were 2 or 3 key people who were both editors and contributors. I want to share the work from Hasan Kwame Jeffries. He is an African-American professor at Ohio State University. He is also the host of the podcast that accompanies the other curricular material. And he helps us understand what they were attempting to do when he says it's often said that slavery was our country's original sin, but it is much more than that. Slavery is our country's origin. It was responsible for the growth of the American colonies, transforming them from far-flung, forgotten outposts of the British Empire to glimmering jewels in the crown of England. And slavery was a driving power behind the new nation's territorial expansion and industrial maturation, making the United States a powerful force in the Americas and beyond. The central role that slavery played in the development of the United States is beyond dispute. And yet we, the people, do not like to talk about slavery. We even think about it, much less teach it or learn it. Then the third point, slavery is hard history. It's hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It is hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It is hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. And it is hard to learn about those who abided it. So this is the framing that Professor Jeffries provides in the opening. And he and David Blight, who I'll read in a moment, try to contrast the almost 200 years of history that flies in the face of everything he's just said here. Because most of our history, and still today, some historians reject what he's saying here, reject the truth that we know, again, from those who lived it, those who wrote about it, those who have now continued to build on that body of knowledge. And it is indeed hard history, as those who study it know. So David Blight, you may know, is a Yale professor, endowed chair, the author of, most recently, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. If you want to know anything about Douglass, that's the book. It's a marvelous work. It's long, like all of these are, but it is well worth your time. Blight was also a contributor, obviously, to this work. That's why I've got him quoted here. He says, slavery is not an aberration in American history. It is at the heart of our history, a main event, a central foundational story. Of all the reasons or justifications used to enslave other human beings, race was late to the long story. Racial slavery came out of the epoch of the slave trade, which of course lasted 400 centuries in the Atlantic. One of the things we focus on in my class, if I can take the aside, slavery's always existed. And we try to make that point clear in every society. There was some form of slavery. Slavery in what would become the United States was unique. Please mute your phone if you're just coming in. What was unique in its racial nature and its inherited nature. So we'll talk more about that later, but obviously Blight is touching on that. He says teachers need to know more of how to tell that story of why slavery became racial in the Americas and then in the United States. Slavery was not born racial as some kind of original sin. It was made so by people in historical time. Slavery has many roots: economic, social, moral, religious, political, and yes, racial. All can be taught to young people because they can see similar impulses today. This report calls on all involved to learn and teach the history of white supremacist ideology, which provides one of the deep roots of slavery. So again, these two gentlemen, along with 13 or 14 others, put this material together, and it is available. There is a magazine. Lois just gave me my monthly edition of Teaching Tolerance. It came in the mail. The website is superb. Everything that I've shared here, all of the podcast, the curriculum materials are available. And I know few of us on the call today are actively teaching anymore young people, but one of our objectives within Manasota ASALH is to get this material into the hands of our school systems, into the hands of our young people, because so often you hear teachers saying, and in the survey that they did, teachers were by far desiring to be able to teach better this subject. They didn't have the background, didn't have the skill set, were afraid of offending their students, were opposed, received opposition from parents. These are answers the teachers gave to the survey as to why you're not teaching this subject, which I touch on here in the survey results. So they want to teach it, but they really lack the ability. And the textbooks don't do the job that they should. And the states, if the states have standards, they're not enforcing those standards, or the standards are inadequate. Let me see. So in kind of concluding this segment, what the folks at Teaching Hard History recommend is that we do obviously need to improve the instruction about American slavery and fully integrate it into U.S. history. Use original historical documents. The historical record is rich and deep. There is no shortage of primary source support for everything that I've just said and for everything that these folks rely on. The failure to use that material is either intentional or negligent, and that's the tragedy. Our textbooks are better than they were when I was in high school, but that's not saying much because they are still far short of what they need to be, and our curriculum material simply has to be made better. Let me go on to this interesting 1619 project. So when we think about this history that I've said America refuses to embrace, it has probably not been made more clear than with the publication of the 1619 project. This project from the New York Times, still available. If you've not seen it, I commend it to your reading. Published by a group of Times reporters and collaborators to commemorate the 400-year anniversary, again, of the first recorded sale of people of African descent in the British colonies. Not the first people of African descent in North America or South America. That's a whole nother history lesson, but trust me when I say there is also superb history that has been done that show that people of African descent certainly traveled with the Portuguese and the Spanish as conquerors, conquistadors all around the southeastern U.S. and South America. But even before then, there is evidence of travel by Africans to this part of the world. So it's a multi-part collaboration. It is well worth the reading, and it was presented with great excitement. I remember Lois and I were traveling, and I knew this material was hitting the Sunday paper, and we're going through an airport. I knew it was coming to the house, but I saw one, and you know how big Sunday Times is. So I threw it in my bag and therefore have an extra copy of it. But it is not without context, which is why I'm discussing it here in this subject. So greatly acclaimed publication, multimedia. There are articles in the Times. There's a podcast that is also excellent. And a curriculum that was developed by the Pulitzer Center that's still available and still being used. The controversy, which I'll get to in a minute, really circled around the lead editor, I'll call Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's a staff writer for the magazine. She wins a Pulitzer for her work in 2019. And almost immediately is hit with a torrent of criticism. You've got to read the opening essay that Nicole Hannah-Jones produced for this project. It is the most superb, concise, 3,000-4,000 word essay that begins with that 1619 landing, brings us through to Black Lives Matter, and it touches on. But let me talk about why it is so controversial. So she's not a historian. She's an essayist, an author. I don't know what her degree is, but she writes beautifully. The criticism comes from within the academy, the American History, the American Slavery Academy, led by, interestingly, three of my favorite historians. James McPherson, I may have read his Battle Cry of Freedom first. Gordon Wood is in all of my classes. He does these great short videos. And James Oakes is a Lincoln scholar. So I have great respect for these five. Sean Wilentz is Yale professor, and he and I have some historiographic differences, but again, brilliant. And I think the essence of their criticism touched on 3 or 4 points, and let me expound on those for just a moment. So in her essay, Nicole Hannah-Jones challenges that 1619 is in fact the true founding of the U.S. And that the enslaved men and women were and should be viewed as the true founders. She builds this essay around her father and growing up in Iowa in a segregated community. He was a poor working man who, she said, flew an American flag with the greatest of pride. It was confounding to her that this son of sharecroppers who had come to the North, promise of opportunity only to be thwarted time and time again, went to fought in World War II, was disrespected, discriminated against, but yet he flew this flag with such great pride. And she said that confounded her for all of her life. She also then says, and I'm reading from her quote, she said, "My father, one of those many Black Americans who answered the call, knew what it would take me years to understand that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as 1776. That Black Americans, as much as those men cast in alabaster in the nation's capital, are this nation's true founding fathers, and that no people has a greater claim to that flag than us. So you can understand how, if you have a certain mindset, that'd be offensive. I think these historians were not so much racist as simply challenging the strength of the 1619 as founders versus the great men who, wrote the Declaration and ultimately the Constitution and became presidents. So that was certainly controversial. The second point was the Revolutionary War fought to protect slavery. That's a controversial, again, within the historical academy. It's a very controversial issue, but there is historical support for the fear of the colonist that England was going to end slavery and impose that abolition on their colonies. She says, conveniently left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. She says, the wealth and prominence that allowed Jefferson at just 33 and the other founding fathers to believe they could successfully break off from one of the mightiest empires in the world came from the dizzying profits generated by chattel slavery. In other words, we may never have revolted against Britain if the founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so, nor if they had not believed that independence was required in order to ensure that slavery would continue. So again, we don't have time today to get into the background, and the debate has always been, was the Civil War caused by slavery or fought over slavery? Well, again, there are brilliant scholars who would tell you the Revolutionary War was also a pro-slavery or an action taken to protect slavery. Third point, for the most part, Black Americans fought back alone. So this is a reference that comes after she's talking about the period after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, the emergence of the Jim Crow system, and the fact that it were Black people who were being brutalized, Black people who were being lynched and murdered, and standing up ultimately through the Civil Rights era to fight against that. And historians took what she was saying in some way as neglect for all of the non-Black participants in that battle. So again, this is one of the, and then lastly, this issue about Lincoln and his racism. If you've read history, you know that that's an ongoing controversy. She simply cites 2 or 3 instances where, if you recall, Lincoln was in favor of colonization. He did not believe that Black people and white people could live together. Indeed, he called a meeting about 1863 in the White House with a group of Black leaders and said, y'all need to get on a boat and get out of Dodge. Because if we win this war, there's no way white folks are going to allow you to live in peace. There was certainly truth to that, because after the war, Black people caught hell, and some would say still do. But these Black gentlemen respectfully told the president, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents are buried here, and here I'll be buried. And so there's a couple of other references here about Lincoln and his attitudes, but it's you have to read this work. The 1619 Project is brilliant. I understand the historians' problems with it, but and there is a new work that's just been published. It's a edited piece. It's called 400 Souls, edited by Ibram Kendi, and I hope you know Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Keisha Blaine, another brilliant young academic. And what they've done is brought together 80 writers of African descent, and each of them cover a 5-year span, so 1619 through current. And in that first essay called Arrival, again, Nicole Hannah-Jones and my book knocks it out of the park. And I don't have time to read. I'd love to read it to you here now, but I commend that to you because she addresses beautifully this very, very important history. Said I wasn't going to read it, but essentially what she does is she contrasts the Mayflower arrival, which was 1620, and she talks about how that's positioned as such a seminal event in our history, and it was, and it is. But she says, but a year before the Mayflower, in 1619, another ship dropped anchor on the eastern shore. Its name was the White Lion, and it too would become one of the most important ships in American history. And yet there is no ship manifest inscribed with the names of the passengers and no descendants society, as is true with the Mayflower. These people's arrival was deemed so insignificant, their humanity so inconsequential, that we do not even know how many were packed into the White Lion. And then she goes on to talk about how, but while every American child learns about the Mayflower, virtually no American child learns about the White Lion. She concludes, the White Lion and the people on that ship have been expunged from our collective memory. This omission is intentional. When we are creating a shared history, what we remember is just as revelatory as what we forget. If the Mayflower was the advent of American freedom, then the White Lion was the advent of American slavery. And so while arriving just a year apart, one ship and its people have been immortalized, the other completely erased. So again, that's another good book for you to read. Let me just touch really quickly on this monument's controversy when we talk about America's inability to see its citizens of African descent as worthy to be counted in that history. That's what this is all about, and that's the fact. And so we see that most clearly as we look at the period I'll call it the lost cause era. So you begin, obviously, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Redemption. For those of you who've taken any of my classes or who read or are historians yourself, you know the importance of each of those events. The war is obvious. Reconstruction was that 12-year period when America really could have been a multi-racial, multilateral, truly diverse society, and it blew it, in want of another term. It was the greatest opportunity, and it blew it. Redemption was a reemergence of white supremacy, the rise of the New South. So this is the redeemed South who come and destroy everything that was built around Reconstruction, and begin again to re-enslave its Black population. And it would take to the end of the Civil Rights era, and we would say, many would say, we're still fighting that battle, as witnessed by the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. That spirit of white supremacy, of my license to do whatever, to whomever, whenever, still runs strong in this country. So the lost cause, this is, again, the movement of white supremacists after the war, who essentially began to decide we're going to change the narrative. The war had nothing to do with Black folks. The war had nothing to do with slavery. This was all a dispute over federalism, over states' rights, cousins fighting cousins. And so it's now done. Let's get back together and let's move on. Which leads into the Jim Crow era and the era, 50 or so years, that historians call the nadir of American democracy, when indeed for much of the Black population, life was a day-to-day threat. And when, as the EJI folks, the Equal Justice Initiative folks would say, more than, you know, they've been able to document 6,000 racial terror lynchings. So Black people burned at the stake, hung, mutilated, men, women, and children. And that terrorism was all about sublimating, subjugating the rights granted after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, to put Black people in their place and keep them there. A part of that whole effort, again, to rewrite history, to revision history, was led by this group, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a group of nice white Southern ladies, primarily, who raise money to glorify the lost cause. And that's where these monuments primarily come from. They weren't built in the 50s and 60s or something. These things were built at almost the turn of the century. And they were indeed built to glorify the men who made war against the United States. And they were put on pedestals and they were glorified, and they were done in the face of large groups of Black people to let them know where they belonged. And not only was this done by groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy, but the academic community, the scholastic community surrounded the effort with so-called scholarship that first and foremost completely rejected any history of Africa, that indeed there was no history in Africa worthy of even mentioning. Forget the generations of African nations that pre-existed even Europe. And so that it begins there, and you have people like John Burgess and William Dunning, who both from Columbia, interestingly, who lead a school of scholars who would now go on to teach at colleges all over the country, high schools all over the country, and they would propagate this lie that indeed, while the South might have lost the war, they won the spirit of the country, and that the war had nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do with Black folks. It was just all a mistake, and it's better. Another book I'll reference as I move quickly to finish here. David Blight has done another book. It's called Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory. And I'm just getting into this, but in the first part of the book, he talks about how this myth was created and how our memory is shaped by things like these monuments and by what our textbooks teach us, and the nefarious intent beneath it all. He specifically refers to the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. So this is 1913 or so, and it's in Pennsylvania, and it's a blue and gray reunion. So you've got the Yanks and the Rebs, all in their 80s and 90s. Thousands of them meet in Gettysburg, and Woodrow Wilson is the guest speaker, which is perfect. If you know Wilson's background and his racism and what he did to really slam the door shut on any hope for Black progress in the early part of the 20th century, he comes to this thing, and you only need to know two things about where America's historical memory is. There were no Black veterans allowed, and there were more than 200,000 Black veterans who signed up, who fought. 70 or so thousand died fighting for the Union. None of them were invited. None of those old soldiers with skin like mine were invited to this thing, and never had been invited to any of these things. And in his speech, and in all of the speeches given over this 4 days around the 4th of July, nothing was said about slavery. Nothing was said about the causes for the war. In fact, it was said specifically, we don't care about the cause of the war because the war is over. We're moving on. So again, thinking about historical memory, thinking about how we tell the story of America, who writes that history? And it's clear here we know who writes that history. Okay, so just let me conclude, and I've only added this because I found it so interesting. So this is the beginning of the last school year, 2020. We've got a new superintendent, and a plan had been in place for some time to do cultural responsiveness training. So this isn't anti-racism training. This isn't, history of American slave. This is how do we get along? And keep in mind, this comes after a summer of Ahmaud Arbery, February 23rd, 2020. Breonna Taylor, March 13th, 2020. And George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. The entire nation is focused on this issue of racial terror, and all that the previous administration of the school board wanted to do is we really need to address some of this stuff as we go into the school year, because the whole world has been in the streets. Well, a group of parents, led by a couple of teachers who apparently attended the first session of this cultural responsiveness training, mischaracterized what the trainer was presenting, and said it was an attack on all whites as racist, and it was all about Black Lives Matter. So the superintendent, of course, hearing this and getting pushback from the community, says he's going to put this training on hold. And I found it interesting that even the chief education officer, who I assume designed this program, had acknowledged before the school year there was a great need and urgency for the training. And 85% of the other folks at the training found the first day positive and beneficial. So my question as I close, with that kind of mindset, and by the way, the superintendent in his decision said he's going to be forming a panel, and I'm told that one of our friends on the Zoom today is a member of that panel. So maybe she's got some insights, or we'll follow with her later to see where it's going. ASALH, Manasota ASALH, sent the superintendent a letter offering our involvement, our willingness to serve on his panel, sharing our views about how important what he was proposing is, and we never heard from the superintendent. So again, he's now formed this panel, and we're interested to see how it goes. But I close with the question: how would the community react to an announcement of a new, fully integrated American slavery curriculum? Again, I'm a teacher on this subject, and so I'm greatly interested. But my guess is you'd get enormous pushback, because that small segment of the community whose historical memory is grounded in white supremacy, grounded in everything that we've been talking about, would see this as an enormous threat. And that's the real tragedy. That's the work that still needs to be done, because until America can confront its true history, until America can reconcile itself to the fact of its history and to the roots of white supremacy that we have seen so plainly on display over the last 4 years, we're never going to be that great multi-diverse, multilateral, exceptional community that we tell ourselves that we are. Let me stop there. I hope there's some questions, and I've run longer than I should have, but let me stop sharing and see if everybody is asleep. So I don't know if we have anything in the chat. Anyway, questions. Let's take a few minutes here.
Thank you, David, for such an interesting and illuminating presentation. You can raise your hand to ask him a question, or you can put it in the chat.
I think I saw a hand.
No, that was me flashing it. It's just,
Jim's showing us how to do it.
but it didn't come up on the screen.
All right.
Okay,
Louise,
I can ask.
Louise. Natalie, don't lose your Louise machinist from
Hey.
my class.
No,
Yeah.
I will.
Hi, David. I'm
How are
glad
you?
I got to be here. I have to leave at 2 o'clock, so I get to get my question in too. It's more of
Good.
a comment, though. It's like defund the police. It seems to me that because there's resistance to change, always among people, but especially in certain circumstances, if just a few or one sort of unfortunate loaded phrase is enough to give people rationalizations to sink a whole ship, which I'm thinking maybe it's kind of unfortunate, some of the wording in those 4 points about the 1619 project. If it weren't for that, I wonder if the reception would have been different. And, I don't know, it's a strategy thing, maybe. What do you think about it? The idea of you can lose the whole cause by sounding too extreme, to the point that it gives somebody justification to just poo-poo or shut down the whole thing. I just want your comments.
Great question. I think in this instance, with the 1619 project, really what you had was an inter-academic debate about some of the work that was done that got much broader exposure to outside of the academy. I mean, there have been a number of really well done papers on this debate back and forth. So it's not like what Nicole Hannah-Jones was offering up was blatantly wrong or misleading. It's simply these historians would have approached some of what she was saying differently. And that's always true in these debates. What added unfortunate negative fuel to it was some of the politicians. Trump formed the 1776 so-called commission, as he said, to tell the true story of America. And I don't know who told him, because he's certainly never read any of this, but so he forms this commission, and there were some senators, Tom Cotton comes to mind, who jumped on the bandwagon. And it was interesting to me that one of the critics of 1619 was even more critical of Tom Cotton. So Sean Willens wrote an op-ed that said, stay out of this. You don't know what you're talking about. And so, defund the police is an example of an unfortunate sort of public characterization. But I think this is a little bit different. It's a argument among scholars that I think is more deep and intellectual than most of us who are just on the fringes of this really understand. Great question. Thanks, Louise. Natalie, you had a question.
Okay. What is the best tool from the Southern Poverty Law Center Teaching Tolerance program to increase tolerance? Is there one that you can point out that's so effective? Is there any that's
I can't point to one, but I would commend everybody to go to the website, because and the beauty, of course, is it is calibrated for grade levels, and they address every possible social justice issue you can imagine. So that's why I say I wouldn't pick one. I know American slavery and teaching the civil rights movement best, because that's what I've used. But I would you could spend a long time, Natalie, trying to see which of those great topics is at the top of the list. They do a wonderful job, and there are lots of great resources like Teaching Tolerance. That's the one that comes to mind. Let me go to I see something in the chat here. There's a comment. I think that the book Caste, Origins of Our Discontent, would be a great required reading resource. So I know many people have read Caste, and it's on my shelf. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'd like to. Other questions? Mrs. Harper? Unmute yourself, dear. Unmute your, yeah.
Okay,
Good.
I'm just
Yes.
wondering if you could just spend a minute talking about the economy of slavery and what that has meant to, we talk about the beginning of this country and the founding and the foundation. Would you speak a little bit about that? Because that was carried on after Reconstruction. It was like going back to slavery, what happened to the people. But the economy itself, would you spend a little time on that, please?
I will, and I'm looking for from her essay, Nicole Hannah-Jones says in just a few paragraphs. Essentially, she makes the point, and we try to make the point in the slavery class, that the value of goods produced by enslaved men and women in the 10 years before the Civil War was 60–70% of what we'd call GDP today.
Wow.
That the value of enslaved bodies, both in terms of their productivity and their ability to be securitized, what was 50% of in any given year, the total value of wealth in the country. And Ed Baptiste, who wrote The Half Has Never Been Told, is probably the current historian, economic historian, who has done the best job of calculating, frankly, why the South was never going to give up its slaves. There are historians who would argue that, well, you know, and Jefferson and many of the founders believed that slavery was going to die out over time. Well, it was absolutely untrue, as history has shown, because it was simply too valuable. If it hadn't been cotton, it would have been rice. If it hadn't been rice, it would have been something else. And so it was inevitable that this war would have to happen, because the North had determined slavery was not going to be expanded. But the seven richest people in the planet in that 10 years before the war lived in and around Natchez, Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
They owned thousands of men, women, and children, huge plantations. And that wealth wasn't only limited to the growers, the planters, the plantation owners. Wealth was made across the board, because in Rhode Island, there were textile mills that obviously took the cotton, converted it, but there were also distilleries that would take the sugar and produce great wealth. And often that wealth in the North was used to finance the triangular trade, we call it. So they were going to go take those goods to the African coast, buy enslaved men, women, and children, and then sell them. Most sold, obviously, in South America and the Caribbean, but almost 500,000 sold in what would become the U.S. And that network, the growth of saleable goods in the South, the application of the use of those goods like textiles in the North, and then the network continues. So Ms. Harper, that's not a great question, great answer to your question, but suffice to say, slavery was never going away, and that the South was willing to secede from the Union because there was too much money to be made, and they were simply not going to give up that wealth.
And could you add to that triangular trade financing the Industrial Revolution throughout
Indeed.
Great Britain and Europe?
Cotton.
Indeed. And so Ms. Harper is talking about how those textiles were used both in New England and in Manchester, in the
Shipbuilding
textile
also.
industry in Great Britain. That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harper. Checking.
Yeah, I wonder, David, if you could had a chance to listen to President Biden last night and could comment on the programs he outlined for racial justice and his reason for optimism in the whole struggle.
I unfortunately was busy preparing this, and I missed President Biden. But isn't it funny how with Biden you don't worry too much about missing a speech or a statement or a tweet?
You'll repeat it.
Whereas over the past 4 years, I was glued to the television to see what that other guy, and I'm told he refers to him as that other guy, was going to do. But Jim, you saw it. What did you think? I missed it. What did you think about what he had to say?
Well, I was quite impressed. He had not only an extensive program for enforcement, and I've been through a bunch of that myself, but at any rate, and also his reason for optimism. And basically what he said was, just watch the ads and you see one of 3 ads with mixed racial couples in them. And so you can see our population today isn't what we've had in the past. We've got a new population, and this new population is not only receptive to, but encouraging programs for racial justice.
Excellent, excellent. And
David,
thanks, Jim. Yes.
I just wanted to mention that it is 3:06, but I also wanted to say that Rana was going to talk about Dr. Asplund and the committee, and just wanted to give her a moment to reflect on that committee's finding.
Yeah. Hi, Rana. Please do.
Okay, well, I'll try to make it brief, which is very difficult for me. But I honestly don't know the purpose of the committee. The reason it was established was because of all this furor that happened. And I will make a little bit, it's not an excuse, but it's a little bit of an explanation. When Dr. Asplund got here, he wasn't even installed as superintendent when, number one, we're dealing with COVID. We're having a very, very chaotic election, both on a national level and on a school board level. And I have been attending school board meetings since 2016. When I started, I thought, boy, this is going to be boring. No way. It was better than any of the best soap operas you'd ever want to see. We had sexual harassment. We had sheriffs and the board members texting rather nasty emails right at the board meeting. It's always chaotic, totally chaotic. And Dr. Asplund jumps right into this. And I believe they had started that education video prior to his, or he was just here a very, very short time, and he was bombarded. And all of you know that you can be in a group and there could be only 1 or 2 people that can suck the oxygen out because they're loud, they're obnoxious, they're noisy. And this is what that group did at every meeting during the summer. And we do have a new board, and I do feel optimistic because I think Dr. Asplund does not have a personal agenda. He listens to people. And he was actually physically upset about what was going on. And he tried to correct all the misinformation that was coming around, the people being brainwashed and all that sort of thing. So his mindset, I think, is where all of us would be. Well, I'm taking for granted we're preaching to the choir here. And so I think his mindset is right. And he's hoping that this committee will be able to bring together the various aspects and the people I kind of push to have somebody from the other side, and I have made friends with her. We have civil conversations together. So I am very optimistic about it. But I also came to the conclusion that the greatest asset we have in our country is also the greatest liability, and that's our diversity. Because we have this marvelous, unbelievable, wonderful mosaic of cultures and people. But we also have people within those little pieces that fear the other. So it's a plus and it's a minus, and heaven help us to solve it.
Thank you, Rana. And Rana, we'll call on you. I'll certainly be in touch with you to see how
Yeah,
that.
please. Oh, yeah, let me quickly, because I knew about Dr. James's letter, and I mentioned it to Dr. Aspling. I got to tell you, he's just being, you can imagine how he's being bombarded. So I will bring that up, because I also said, we don't have to go outside. One of our greatest assets is you guys in Asala. I mean, just imagine if one or two of you went and spoke to the high school classes. I mean, you're here and you're a fabulous resource. So that's going to be one of the big things I'll bring up at the committee meeting. And thank you all.
All right. Any other pressing, I see there's a little chat conversation going on. Anything else pressing before we release you all and thank you for, I don't want to miss anybody that has, so I did find the quote, Mrs. Harper, and I'll close with that, recognizing you're respecting your time. But this again is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She says, through back-breaking labor, they cleared the land across the Southeast. They taught the colonists to grow rice. They grew and picked the cotton that at the height of slavery was the nation's most valuable commodity, accounting for half of all American exports and 66% of the world's supply. They built plantations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, sprawling properties. They attract thousands of visitors from across the globe, captivated by the history of the world's greatest democracy. They laid the foundation of the White House and the Capitol, even placing with their unfree hands the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol dome. They lugged the heavy wooden tracks of the railroads that crisscrossed the South and that helped take the cotton they picked to the northern textile mills, fueling the Industrial Revolution. They built vast fortunes for the white people, North and South. At one time, the second richest man in the nation was a Rhode Island slave trader. Profits from Black people's stolen labor helped the young nation pay off its war debts and finance some of the most prestigious universities. It was the relentless buying, selling, and insuring and financing of their bodies and the products of their labor that made Wall Street a thriving banking, insurance, and trading sector, and New York City the financial capital of the world. So that was the quote I was looking for, Ms. Harper. I'm glad I thank you all very much for holding that. And again, thanks to the Congregation of Humanistic Judaism for their remarks.
Wonderful speech.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, David.